They're just having a quick power.
We're not going to church, or we should go to church. Whatever y'all want to do. Hey, hi everybody. How you doing? I'm Mitch.
I'm Mitch.
Oh man, you the guy that spends all the money. Mass card expensive.
Okay, thank you. Good morning. Good morning. Elbow bumps. Good morning. How you doing? Oh yeah, absolutely.
Good morning. I know. I'm Roxanne. Hello, everyone. Good morning. Good morning. I'm bringing my little cough drops. Just.
Do y'all mind? Can I ask you a question, Adam? I know you're the boss.
Is this water?
Are they just going to participate by listening?
That's right.
That's kind of the thought. You don't want to do that. That's fine. We're gonna, this is your show. Absolutely.
Please do.
I want to. Yeah. Okay. I want to stand up and talk to everybody if that works. Is that okay?
Oops, I'm sorry. Yes.
Okay.
This is not hot until
Yes, it's hot. So, good morning, everybody. We're still working out our logistics here, but welcome so much to our first budget work session. And the focus is equity, and we have Mayor Mitch Landrieu here with us. Thank you so much, and his team. Just a little bit of housekeeping. The mics, you just push the buttons I think you've got, and they come on and off. We're going to get Mayor Landrieu a mic to walk around with. Before we get started, our manager had a small public service announcement, I guess we would call it,
Yes,
he'd like to make.
Sure. Thank you,
Mr.
Madam
Schwartz.
Chair, because I'm hoping a lot of people are tuning in and listening. On Wednesday evening, and we will announce the time probably at 7 o'clock, we're going to do a virtual town hall on COVID-19, and that will include Dr. Varghese, our public health director, along with Aaron Miller, who is going to keep us safe from calamity like he used to do in New Orleans. And also encourage people, we are up to date on our webpage. There's really a lot of information out there, and people can learn a lot by just taking a few minutes to read. So that was just my public service announcement, and back to you.
That's great, thank you. And as you may have noticed, I'm trying to greet people with elbow bumps. We're kind of trying to do that. It seems to be kind of fun and sort of works. So instead of pressing the flesh that way, we just knock elbows. Yes,
One more time,
absolutely.
What time is the virtual town hall?
I think not set yet.
It's either going to be at 6:30 or 7, and we'll get information out on that.
Yeah, we will. Thank you so much. And let's see, just before we go, I think as many of you know, our colleague, my Vice Chair, Eric Gutschall, will not be with us today. He is dealing with a health crisis, and we miss him, and our thoughts are with him and his family today. It's delightful to have everyone here. Budgets are value statements, so it's really appropriate that this is our first budget work session with you, Mayor Landrieu. Now, yeah. It's kind of a work session. We're gonna have fun, I think. I hope.
We could wrap up the budget today.
Maybe not. This is Arlington. This is Arlington, probably not today, but we're going to start, and I appreciate any efforts you have to get us to a conclusion. And we've got his team here from E Pluribus Unum, which I will let you introduce. Now, when we're up here on the dais, we usually do Madam Chair, Mr. Dorsey, Mr. Schwartz. Sometimes in work sessions, we do Mark, Christian, Libby. So it's up to you, because I'm getting the guess that you like to be called Mitch rather than Mayor
I like
Landrieu.
Mitch. Mitch, would that be good? You can call me Mayor Mitch. That's what we're calling people now. But
Are you making an announcement?
No. But that for another day.
Okay.
It used to be that mayors never could run for president. This time we had 5 mayors that ran for president. So I'm just saying to the county executive, maybe you're going to be the candidate in 2024. But Mitch would be great. Thank you.
I'd like a little gender equity,
All right, well, then you run.
Just saying, yeah, okay. Anyway, thank you so much. So it's going to be your show, and first names is absolutely fine. I do want to say just a little introduction, because there may be some people here who don't know you. So when you were mayor of New Orleans, Mitch led efforts to advance racial equity in local government, implementing the city's first racial equity plan. You're also an author. You wrote In the Shadow of Statues, your book here, which I have not read the whole thing, but read. It's wonderful. Since leaving office, you've dedicated your time to advancing racial equity in the South. We're kind of the South. We sort of go back and forth. E Pluribus Unum is an initiative that was incubated at Emerson Collective, which I did not know of, so I did a little Google search on that. That was interesting, which I will not fill you in on, but you can go online and check it out. It was created to fulfill America's promise of justice and opportunity for all by breaking down the barriers that divide us by race and class. We're honored to have you here with us today. Very much looking forward to learning from you, kind of how we can make, there are a lot of nice things you can say about equity, but how to infuse it into the budget and make it a reality. We're loving the opportunity to learn from you. Thank you. Take it away.
Libby, thank you. Y'all mind if I do this? This is hard for me. This is much better. Is this okay? So I can see everybody? All right. First of all, thank y'all for having me. I do recognize that I am in the South. Is that right? Y'all want to have a fight about that? I mean, is that we're going to start like, are we in the South?
Just barely.
I'm telling you we're in the South. At least geographically. We may not be in the South in your mind, but geographically, we're in the South. I have this fight with people in Texas, Miami, like, okay, well, where the hell do you think you are? We have a saying in New Orleans when we say, how are you? We also say, where you at? Where you at? And that doesn't mean physically, where are you? Although it could. But it also could mean, where are you? Like, just where are you? And there is to start off the question, there's a very interesting thing about where people place themselves. Spiritually, physically, emotionally, politically, where are you? It's not necessarily what people assume of them, and it's a worthwhile question to ask when you start a discussion. So anyway, where you at? It's so nice to be here. I want to just introduce my team, if you don't mind. Sarah Robertson Miller is right there. She is my chief of staff and has been working with me for a very, very long time. You might recognize her last name because she and Aaron Miller, right, who ran Homeland Security and was also a little bitty boy when he came to work for me. He was like this big, and he grew up. Jeffrey Hebert was the chief administrative officer for the city of New Orleans when I was the mayor, and the first chief resilience officer in the world. Is that fair? You want to claim that? You people from the Netherlands are going to bust us up. We had the first chief resilience plan when we started working on climate change in New Orleans, and it was the first one nationally, and I think it was the first one in the world where we began to really think about how we were going to prepare ourselves for climate change, what was coming, and then how to fortify ourselves in every way so that we could receive what we know was coming our way in broad terms. That's climate change in 30 seconds. Roxanne Franklin-Lauria is with us, doctor, who is a PhD, who has been working with the city of New Orleans for a long time and is now working with EPU that helped design the equity agenda for the city of New Orleans, and Jeff helped implement it. Aaron did nothing except protect the city from Katrina, Rita, Ike, Gustav, the national recession, the BP oil spill, 4 mass shootings, a bucket load of hurricanes, and a lot of other stuff. So the most appropriate way, yeah, you got the best. You got the best in the country. Although I do think that y'all probably have a lot of security assets in and around where y'all happen to live at. Is that true? I mean, just a couple. But to start off at the obvious place, and then I'll get into equity, one thing that our team, unfortunately, got to be really good at was emergency response and Homeland Security. We really did. Our team had to respond to more natural and or man-made disasters than any other government in America, and we developed an expertise around that. We had the first false positive Ebola case that was coming up the Mississippi River from Liberia with a person on it that presented as an illness, and we were the first ones that had to deal with it before the real positive case occurred in Dallas 2 weeks later back in the day. And so coronavirus is something that's right in our wheelhouse, and I know that y'all are going to have a session on it in a bit. But the general rules on these things are, A, be prepared, and we're not. B, prepare for the worst and hope for the best, which we're in the process of doing and catching up on. C, don't be arrogant and think that you can contain something that you can't contain. So it's not contained, but that doesn't mean that you should panic. And we're going to get our feet underneath us soon. And the order of the day, if I might offer this to the leaders of this community, when you're dealing with an emergency response, is A, be transparent, B, be truthful, C, rely on science and the experts, and keep everybody informed. And then we will find a way through whatever it is that we're dealing with. And those rules are true whether you're dealing with hurricanes, whether you're dealing with a terrorist attack, whether you're dealing with a shooter, all of which y'all have had a little taste of. And so as the nation kind of moves through this uncertain period, at least for another 2 weeks, because we're starting to understand that it actually has spread significantly in the United States beyond the 25 or the 40. You'll begin, I think, if this thing follows its normal path, and I have no reason to believe that it won't, that we will become aware of when we start testing more positives. And then right now the federal government hopefully is getting their feet underneath them and starting to rethink how to rethread its communication between the federal, state, and local governing authorities, as well as the hospitals, to figure out where the testing is going to be done, and whatever else has to happen. But we're a little bit behind the 8 ball. And I would just say, as a country, it's going to take us a minute, and you're going to have to figure out what role you guys play in that. So I'll commend that to you, and you are in spectacular hands in regards to connected relationships with other governments across the country, as well as the federal government. So I wish you well. Let's talk about race, if you don't mind. I was born in 1960. That was a time when George Wallace, Bull Connor, lots of hard stuff was continuing to happen in the South. I am one of 9 children. My mother had 9 kids in 11 years. She was pregnant with me in 1960 when my father, who had just gotten elected to the legislature as a young kid who didn't know anybody, was one of 2 legislators that voted against our governor's segregation plan, and was told that day when I was in utero that from Leander Perez, who was the biggest segregationist in the South, that he was going to be dead. And basically my life has been that way since I've been born. Essentially, I'm skipping over a lot of history because we don't have enough time to go through it, but that's kind of where I grew up. And my father, they said that he was dead. I think they intended physically, but they certainly intended it politically. He went on to become a councilman at large, the mayor of the city of New Orleans, the secretary of housing and urban development. He has a daughter that was a United States senator and a state treasurer, the youngest in the country. He had a son who was a lieutenant governor, mayor, and a state representative, and a whole bunch of other kids that did a lot of great stuff. So I tell you that not just to tell you how proud I am to be part of my family, but hate doesn't always have its way. And if he would have gave up his courage at that point in time and not done what he was supposed to do, and just basically said, I'm going to be who I am, and I believe what I believe, and I'm going to push forward, we very, very well may not have had the opportunity to serve, in my family collectively, 110 years of public service between me and my father and my brothers and sisters. And he has, in so many ways, been such a great example for us. But our experience was not that unique now looking back on it. Yesterday was the 55th anniversary of the beating on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. John Lewis, who was my hero and a living saint, showed up. He took a whooping on that bridge 55 years ago, and as he said, gave a little bit of blood. So there have been lots of people that have been in this struggle for a very, very long time. And it should not be a surprise to us, nor should we be willfully ignorant of where we have been in this country, where we are, and where we're supposed to go. You can love America and be a great patriot and still question and challenge whether or not America has lived up to her promise. I would actually argue that your patriotism requires you to challenge your country to be who she says she is supposed to be. And I don't need to give anybody in here a civics lesson, but it is worth, just like going back to read the Bible every week, you know, about whether or not we do what we say we should do. All men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. We run through that like we run through, I'm a Catholic, like we run through the Hail Mary so fast that you forget the words or you forget to think what they mean. because it's right. But if you slow down and say all men are created equal and think to yourself, okay, I'm going to stop right there. Why is it men? Why is equal? What does that mean? And are endowed by their creator. Well, that's interesting because I thought they used to pass down rights from kings to kids, but they don't do that anymore. They endow, you got your rights from someplace else, with certain inalienable rights. What does the word inalienable mean? It means something that nobody can take from you. It's yours. It's like not anybody's to grant you. It is yours. And what are they? Of life, of liberty, and then we use the pursuit of happiness. I don't know about y'all, but when I read that, I'm like, that's a weird thing. Like, what does that pursuit of happiness, like, where did that come from? Came from John Locke. But it didn't, you see, because he said property. But there's no question that when they wrote the Constitution, he was the influence. So if you're an inquisitive person, you sit there and you think, well, why'd they change that? If you're an aggravating inquisitive person like me. And you go, well, why did they change that? What did they mean by property? And in our mind, at least in my limited mind, I think property is a physical thing, like a chair or a car that I own. Well, it turns out that property turned out to be human beings, one thing of property. But the way Locke meant it, he meant everything that a person's physical ability produced, their intellectual capital, right? The value of their work. And so all of a sudden there was this little weird thing that happened when the founders were looking at that, because they were dealing, I believe, this is just what I believe. I can't prove this. This is my interpretation. They knew that they were living in a contradiction, and they couldn't say property because they weren't ready. This is what I just think. They weren't ready to deal with the fact that they were about to contract a document that jumped us way ahead, but also kept us where we were. Because if they would have said property, it would have been really hard to confront the fact, well, excuse me, that person that's enslaved, he's property. And by the way, his work is property. And they never dealt with it. So this nation, this great nation, was formed at a time, and I would have to say on an idea that was greater than any other nation was formed, which is on freedom and liberty, but it wasn't completely truthful. It wasn't completely honest. And I think they knew that and said, well, we're going to find the courage at some point in time to deal with that. And over time, through the abolition of slavery, right, and the Civil War, they said they did. But there's a difference between de jure and de facto. And this is true for all lawyers that write any laws. You can tell somebody what to do, but you can't make them do it. Or as your mama would say, you can draw a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. And so in this kind of notion of being a patriot, I think that, and this is why I think the Founding Fathers wrote it, they did know this, that when they were trying to create a new constitution, it was a constitution that was written in opposition to King George. That's why the Bill of Rights is there. If you go look at the Bill of Rights, and then you go look at the Declaration of Independence about why we separated ourselves, the Bill of Rights is an answer to the Declaration of the explanation of why we separated ourselves and the things we needed to protect ourselves. And we kept saying that equality and liberty were the things that set us apart. And when you think about it, it is the idea of America that makes us unique. And that's good, and that's something that we should all be proud of, and that's something that we should all fight for. And by the way, freedom is not free. Somebody's got to bleed for it. Nope. I got 5 kids. I'm just going to tell you, nothing's free. When I'm paying for it, it might be free for them, but somebody is paying in blood, sweat, tears, or money. So when this whole thing was really done, this nation, it took us a very long time to confront the obvious fact that we were not living up to what we said we were supposed to be. In other words, like from my neighborhood, it would be, well, if you're going to talk the talk, you better walk the walk. All right? And so when the founders were looking at this, they knew and they thought it was really important in order to preserve America that you had to have a thing called dissent, and that we were better and we were sharper and we were tougher when we allowed every citizen to criticize their government, to redress their grievances against the government. It's written in the First Amendment. That's why it's there. So it is, in my opinion, a way to praise your country by confronting it and holding her to the standards by which we, the citizens, have said we're supposed to be. And I say that to you because it's the answer to the question that everybody asks is, why are you criticizing the country? I'm not criticizing the country. I'm offering the country a way to be better. And in the 30 years that I served, 16 as a state legislator, 6 as a lieutenant governor, 8 as the mayor of a city, deepest southern state that I adore. And let me tell you something, I love the South. I mean, I'm a Southerner. I don't hate on the South like our friends from the North. I don't think people from the South don't know how to read and write and don't have shoes. It bothers me when people think that about us. But my heart bleeds for our country when I think about how much we have lost by not reaching out and holding each other close, but pushing each other away and excluding people and are treating them not equally, which is not only unjust, but it hurts us as well. And my experience in my life, this just comes from experience. It's informed by what I learned about government and my experience, but that essentially every organization that I know of in my life that has become exclusive, all white or all black, right? Just men, just women, every one of those organizations that wants to exist in the modern world has gotten smaller, has gotten weaker, and has gotten less valuable. Every one of them that has been open, that invited people in, that has gotten more diverse, that has lifted people up, has gotten bigger, stronger, and better. So I have concluded, based on my empirical analysis of just being a human being and the joy that I feel being with other people, is that diversity is a strength. It's not a weakness. It is, in fact, our calling card. I know this to be true because I grew up in New Orleans, and we live in a really diverse place. And in my opinion, it just feels better and acts better and knows better than going to one place that seems to be narrow and thinks that they know all of the answers. That's part one. Part two, there is no question in my mind that slavery was this nation's original sin, but racism continues to be our Achilles heel. Now, I'm not accusing all you white people in here of anything, but I will note, as being a white man from the South, which I am very culturally competent to be, by the way, that particularly white people get real nervous when you start saying white, because very few people like we don't have to wear our color the way African Americans do. If you don't understand that phrase, ask an African American person what it means to have to wear your blackness. Am I right? I got a lot of nodding heads in here. Amen. Most white people, like, they never heard that before, but we get real nervous. We get real nervous when we start talking about race. And I've come to learn, notwithstanding how important it is, that we're just not good at it, number one. And number two, we have to give each other space. But you can only do that if you understand that it currently exists, A, that you think it's bad, B, and that you want to get to the other side of it. So let me talk about getting to the other side of it for a second. Racism is not something that's going to go away by itself. You see this coronavirus? I know y'all thought I was talking about Homeland Security. I actually wasn't. I was talking about race. Because race is like a virus, just like violence. It's transmitted from person to person. It actually goes, and unless you interrupt it, and unless you contain it, unless you treat it, and unless you actually cure it, you can't get to the other side of it. If you just leave it alone, it'll keep getting. And hate is like that. And you can see that from a long time ago, that hate was passed from generation to generation. There's a song back in the 50s from a Rodgers and Hammerstein show called South Pacific. Y'all remember, all the old people remember this. The youngsters may not. You've got to be taught to hate and fear. You've got to be taught from year to year. It's got to be drummed in your dear little ear. You've got to be carefully taught. And we've known this from time to time. But what has happened over a long period of time is that we, lots of us, walk by things every day that have been there a long period of time that are painful because we're not walking in other people's shoes, and we don't think much about it. Hence the monuments. Y'all are going through this argument right now about these Confederate monuments. And most of the white folks in my neighborhood, when I said we ought to take them down, got really mad at me and said, man, why are you stirring up a hornet's nest? Those things have been there forever. That's not true. But that's what they thought, been there forever in their life. And, you know, who's that supposed to bother? And, you know, essentially, if you think about it, if you ask a person of color, well, did you know that Confederate monument was there? They say, yeah, I walk by it every day. And it gives me pain and it gives me agony, but I've never felt the freedom to tell you all that. And I've never felt the freedom to let you know what that makes me feel like. And so those monuments, in my opinion, were put up way after the Civil War, not right after the Civil War, in an effort to tell a story that was not true, which was that somehow the nation lost something terribly when the United States beat the Confederacy, and that somehow the Civil War was fought for economics and not to preserve slavery. And then after the South lost, the Confederacy, they put monuments up to the losing team, right, and revered them for trying to destroy the nation. Now, if you're a white person, it shouldn't be that hard for you to step into the shoes of an African-American person who would have been enslaved had the Confederacy won and feel their discomfort and their curiosity about why we're revering individuals who fought a war to maintain slavery. I don't think that should be difficult for us in the second decade of the 21st century. But unfortunately, it really is, which is to say that we have not gone through the recognition and the realization that racism is alive and well, and that the consequences of slavery continue to exist today. To which people say to me, that's absurd. That happened a long time ago, and I didn't have anything to do with it. So let me just stop right there and tell you about my daddy. My daddy was born in 1930. My daddy is going to be 90 years old this year. He was the young kid that voted against the segregation package when his wife had 4 children at home and 1 in utero when his life was threatened. He sat on his great-grandmother's lap. He touched her. He physically touched her. She was the child of a slave. His other grandmother, he sat on her lap. Both of these women were alive in 1860, which is to say that they were alive when slavery was enforced, the Civil War was going on, and before Abraham Lincoln died. So I hug and kiss a man who hugged and kissed a physical person that was alive at the time that we're talking about. That's not that long ago. That's like yesterday. That's the blink of an eye. This man can remember, like he was a little boy, what his grandmother looked like, what she smelled like, what she felt like, and things that she said to her. So when you say to me, man, don't talk to me about that, that was a long time ago, I'm telling you in the sweep of history, it's a nanosecond. And for us to think that somehow we're not infected by something that happened that short time ago is ignorant. Now, I didn't call you stupid, I called you ignorant. Ignorant and stupid are different things. There are stupid people that do foolish things that they're not supposed to be. But what I'm saying is that what we're learning in our work is that people are unknowing. And it's okay because you can be forgiven for not knowing, either because you didn't look or you didn't want to know or somehow somebody taught you wrong. But I don't think we can be forgiven for saying I'm going to ignore that forever, or now that I have come to know that it's damaging, I am not going to be willing to change. A, because it's just and it's fair, but B, because it's better for us. And so I call this a diversity dividend. Like a lot of white people think, man, this is a zero-sum game. If these brown people and these black people come up in here and by 2040 they run in the roost, they're going to treat me like I treated them, and I'm not going to have a job, and I'm going to jail, and they're going to do to me what they're going to do to us what we did to them. I think that's what some white people think. To which I say to them, rest easy, because that's not what's going to happen. Now, why do I know that? I know that because in my experience in my life, when African Americans and women and Hispanics and other people have ascended, right, they have been very kind and very open and very loving because they have already lived the pain and the experience of exclusion, and so their heart is open and moving forward, although it's not a fait accompli. Let me just be clear about this, because I'm Italian too. You know, when the Italians got a little money in their pocket, right? And the Irish got a little money in their pocket, they forgot that people treated them like dogs. And, you know, all of a sudden, you know, the old Bible about it's harder for a rich man to get into heaven than a camel to go through the eye of a needle. It turns out that all us human beings are kind of alike. When we start getting, it gets a little harder to give. And that cuts across racial lines too. So here's a big story for everybody. As different as we are, 99% of the time, white people and black folks are a lot alike in how we treat each other. And so it's got to be a commitment across race. And this is what Dr. King taught us and John Lewis taught us about. You really got to kind of begin to start thinking about living this and not just talking about it. So when I finished being the mayor, I thought, what the heck am I going to do? I like making money, but it's not the most important thing in my life. So I didn't want to go practice law again, although maybe I'd be pained enough to have to do that one time in my life. The thing that occurs to me about our country is we're never, ever going to be as great as we say we are or as great as we say we want to be if we can't be good first. And goodness comes from treating other people well and living our truth or living what we say is our truth about diversity being a strength, not a weakness. And one of the things that I found in my work is that race continues to really haunt us from all sides because we've never gone through it. Now, I've gone around it. I've gone under it. I've gone over it. I've tried to avoid it. I've gotten yelled at about it. But I want to try to help see if we can learn from each other about how to go through it. And going through it means completely changing a way, not just creating a thing, but a way of being, changing our hearts, changing our minds. I can pass a law that says you're supposed to do something, integrate the schools with all deliberate speed. But man, if I don't control the mechanism for doing it, and I don't control the hearts and the minds, it was like when I tried to take those damn statues down, and I couldn't find a crane or an operator. I was the mayor. I was powerful as the mayor. You dog, was I powerful? We have a strong mayor system in New Orleans. The mayor's powerful. I gave away, contracts through public bid, but we were doing billions. You would have think that I could have just said I need a crane, I could not find a crane. I couldn't find a company that wasn't intimidated enough. Now, it took me a while and we found somebody, but I felt like, oh my God, this must be what it means to be able to pass a law, which we did legally and ethically, and then not be able to do the thing that the law says we were supposed to do. And if you live in that space for a minute, then you understand what African Americans have been dealing with for a long time, from the beginning of right after the Civil War through Reconstruction, all the way through the Civil Rights Act, even today with voter suppression and gerrymandering, right? The ideas are give everybody a chance to vote, but man, you know what? People making it harder and harder and harder for people to get to the door to sign up to actually, go do what they need to do. And so there is a big difference between de facto and de jure, right? We need to get to de jure and de facto and make it happen. And the only way you're going to do that is if people open up their hearts and minds. And so I would say to you about this argument that y'all are having right now about whether to take monuments down or change the names of streets or change the names of schools. I don't think we ought to be revering people that tried to destroy the United States of America to preserve slavery. That's my personal opinion. But I also agree that if that's all you do, if you just change the names and you don't change everything else that actually caused them to be named that way, then you hadn't done nearly as much as you need to do. And by the way, that's just a very small part that references why we are so out of the way. It's got to be the soul of what it is that we're talking about that has to change, which gets to, okay, well, smart pants. When we figure out how to talk to each other, what's the answer to the question about how we do this? In my mind, and we're still in the middle of this, we didn't know, so we went around the country asking. So for the last year, our team, E Pluribus Unum, that's funded by the Emerson Collective, traveled to 28 counties in the South through 13 states, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia. We went through Appalachia, the region of Appalachia that goes through a number of different states. We hung out in West Virginia. We hung out in Dogpatch, Kentucky. We went to the Delta, Indianola, Sunflower County, and we listened to people talk to us about what their thoughts, what their hopes, what their fears were. Because I had a premonition that, having been as the mayor and kind of sitting up here, and even though I was very much ground up and I had tons of community meetings, I was dealing with New Orleans itself, and there were things happening around the country that maybe I was missing. And in my listening to MSNBC and Fox and CNN and CBS and ABC, I was curious about whether or not they were speaking the same language of the people on the ground. The answer is not completely, but mostly not. Or the tone or the context is different, and the messages that you learn from the street are boxed up and talked about in a way that really doesn't reflect the soul of what's happening on the ground. But we spent a year doing this. We did 800 interviews. Some of them were individual interviews for a half hour. Some of them were focus groups. Some of it was polling. And we were trying to figure out whether or not we thought we could find common ground or what we could learn about how you talk about race and how you improve communities. And so as a consequence of that, Dr. Roxanne Franklin Lauria designed the instrument for our conversations. We went through a bunch of different cities, and I would encourage y'all to have a conversation like this in Arlington, which will help you try to figure out, and start listening to each other talk about what's wrong and how you fix it. Now, I would say this as a parent, and everybody in here that's a child or everybody that's got kids knows that people get in fights from time to time. And your mama makes you fix your stuff before you go to sleep. If you have brothers and sisters, I had 8 of them. We used to fight all the time. My mama used to make us kneel on the ground and face each other and lean our heads against each other. So we depended on each other for our stability. And no matter how mad I was, after about 10 seconds, you start laughing and giggling. At the end of the day, there's got to be an I'm sorry, and there's got to be an I forgive you. Now, if you think about it in this context, the country's having a hard time saying I'm sorry in a thoughtful, authentic way. And we're not in a position right now, we the country, of asking the African-American community to say, I forgive you. Although the African-American community's got to, although it's not one community, by the way, got to start thinking about, well, how could we ever get to that, and what would it look like? And when we do, will I be willing? I'm telling you that question's coming, but not yet. Because we're still working on the, can you recognize that we did something wrong? Can you recognize that what we have today is still a vestige of what we had then? And can you move this discussion into a place where we get past it? That could be 50 years, it could be 10 years, and if we're really wonderful, it could happen today, but it's not. I'm just giving you the broad parameters. And as you go through these different communities, we learned a couple of things that we thought were helpful. And we came up with what we said are 15 truths that we learned from this body of work that we did. I'm not going to go through all of them. They're in a report called Divided by Design that you can find at unumfund.org. And essentially, I'll give you the top of the line finding from the study that we did. Our country is the way it is because we designed it this way. Okay? I need you to marinate in that for a second, because it's a painful thing to acknowledge, but in my opinion, it is not debatable. We are the way we are, and the institutions are the way they are because we designed them to be this way. Some through malignant intent, some through benign neglect. To which you would say, well, I don't know, I feel okay. I walk by this stuff all the time. I get up, I go to work. I take my car to work. I don't have to catch the bus. The way that I get to work is easy. I don't have to go around. I don't have to cross a railroad track or a lake or a river. I get up and I go to work. I don't live in a neighborhood that's spewing stuff out of a chemical plant that lives next to me. What's the problem? Everything's cool. Well, yeah, well, maybe you ought to put yourself in somebody else's shoes and ask yourself how y'all got where y'all got. I was here a couple of weeks ago. I was laying in my hotel room looking at the paper and looking at all these parents that supposedly lived in a liberal enclave killing each other about where their kids were going to go to school because they didn't have enough room to get into school. Right? And so you want to scratch somebody's itch about race, start messing around with where everybody's kids can go to school. And then go talk to some African American parents about where their kids to go to school, and then ask yourself, well, how that school district got drawn. especially if not all the schools are good, which we don't have in America. So you ask yourself, well, how did that school district get designed? What about the votes in the legislature? How come the legislature never acts right? I don't know. Ask yourself how the legislative districts got cut. When you think about where people live, and then you think back to, especially many people here, a lot of people who have served in the military. Thank you so much for doing that. My daddy was in the JAG Corps. My older sister was actually born on Glebe Road when my mom and dad were serving in the Pentagon. Sound familiar? Right? So when you think about that, he came home and everybody got a little piece of that GI Bill. Y'all remember? Anybody old enough in here to remember the GI Bill? Anybody here old enough to remember that you didn't get a piece of that? That allocation was not equitably given. Now, what's the biggest piece of value you have in your life? Your house, right? And so who was able to build generational wealth over time with the property that John Locke talked about, that the founding fathers tried to dissipate by saying the pursuit of happiness? And if you miss 4 generations of building generational wealth, I understand that Elizabeth Warren or Bernie are mad at the people who have and the people that don't, but it's not just because of the institutions today that created the wealth gap between African Americans and white people, and the discrepancy, or the maternal mortality rate. Those discrepancies have been baked in over time, because back in the 30s, when people were trying to buy houses and the banks were redlining, African Americans couldn't get loans. So I'm now, without getting into too much detail, you can go look all of this stuff up. Most of the institutions, the financial institutions, the educational institutions, the government institutions, were operating off of a principle that we are not equal. And if that's the principle, then the design, if it follows the principle, produces an unequal result. Now look, I know y'all don't work for me, but if y'all did, we would be having a discussion in my office that I have with my deputy mayors about the difference between being easy and hard and simple and complex. Something can be real simple but hard to fix. This is real simple. This is not complex. This is real simple, and it's real easy. It was designed this way. That's how simple it is. It's hard to fix because we have a hard time admitting, because somehow we feel guilty, although I didn't do it, but I benefited from it. So when you start talking about white privilege, white people get like, oh, hell no. I did everything in my life I'm supposed to do. I was a perfect human being. I didn't own a slave. I didn't treat anybody bad. I didn't do anything wrong. And by the way, everything I have, I earned on my own. All right, here's big news for all y'all. None of y'all got anything on your own. None of y'all. White people, black people, brown people. Kiss your mom and your daddy and your brothers and sisters and people that lifted you up. But putting that issue aside, there's no question that some people had more benefits than others because of those that came before us. Now, there is the extraordinary human being amongst us who, no matter how burdened they were with all of the terrible things in their life, was so gifted by God that they were able to get out. That's the superhero theory. But I want you to ask yourself, how many fantastic people you think we've left behind in this country, white and black, because they didn't have access to the tools they needed so that they could realize their God-given potential? And how far behind you think our country is in growth, domestic product, national security, economic opportunity, because the best people are not on the field. So when somebody tells you we're a meritocracy, you start laughing. Now, I'm going to say something that I never said. This is not an LSU-Alabama football game, by the way. But if it were, the Civil War wasn't, but if it were, can you imagine fielding a team without any African-American athletes? Can you imagine saying the best football players in the South are white guys and white guys only? I think that team would get beat today. Don't you think? And one of the things we find in the work that we're doing, and this is so obvious, it's painful to actually have to have somebody tell you this, is this art, music, and sports brings us together. You know why? Besides the fact that we can see ourselves in it and it's richly cultural, because you can't hide merit on the stage. I mean, you can either sing or you can't sing. You can either play ball or you can't play ball, right? You can either produce a picture that people like to see or you can't. How many people go watch a movie or go watch a basketball game or go to the Folgers or Ford's Theater or Arena or anywhere that y'all go around here to get edified, you know, and to say to that person, that was terrible. That was just terrible. I spent $50 watching that, but I'm glad that white person did it or the black person did it. I mean, have you ever done that? You go, You can see it like right away. But you can also see yourself when it's beautiful and it's wonderful. What you're listening to, you're not looking at the person's skin color. You're listening to the artist or the musician, or you're seeing the beauty of the acrobat or the joy of the basketball player and just the sheer essence of humanity. And you can see yourself in that, and you can see through color. Those things bring us together. That's one of the truths that we learn. And I don't, as a white person, not that I speak for all white people, but in my experience, I can claim that I worked hard and I was personally responsible and I was disciplined and I was focused, and my effort helped get me where I am, while simultaneously recognizing that I had the benefit that other people did not have. Now, to me, that doesn't scare me, but evidently that scares a lot of other people. So one of the things we learned is white people do not have a good sense of institutional racism. They generally think that when you're thinking about discrimination, a personal act of malice towards another person that doesn't look like them, by calling them out of their name or not giving them something they're entitled to, they don't really have a sense of institutional racism. And what we're trying to do for the country is help the country look into itself. And when I say the country, now I mean you, Arlington, since you asked me to help you. You have to really kind of do a deep dive, and every person's got to look into themselves, the neighbors, the churches, the synagogues, and the institutions, whatever they may be, cultural, civic, political. But this is a political organization, all right? And so you got two things going on here. One is your day-to-day operations of your government. Who gets the jobs, who gets paid, right, et cetera, et cetera. In this, as a corporate body, you have to think about, are we treating everybody fairly? That's the first thing. So equality is very important. But equality is not the same thing as equity. They're very different things. They're kind of cousins, but they're not the same thing. So like if one person's ahead and one person's behind, and you give them the equal amount of money, they're still going to be as far apart as they were before. You feel me? All right. So equality, right? Anti-discrimination. But equity is kind of trying to close the gap. So let's take it out of race for a second, because this helps with white women, particularly. Because you're talking about race, if you're white in the South, their ears close. But if you say, well, wait a minute, let me talk to you about equity in terms of women and men and pay, they go, oh, I get that real quick. So the concept. Most people don't know what equity is, though. And I travels around the South. So this is Dr. Roxanne. I don't want to tell you this because I want to tell you I told you so. This is the foremost expert on equity in America, really. I mean, not kidding. That's not the joke. That's true. But the work that she's been doing is on racial equity. So she says, well, let's go talk to these people about equity. And I say to her, girl, I'm from the ground. I'm telling you, these people don't know what equity is. So we said, well, let's try. So in the focus groups, we asked these people, we didn't tell them what equity was. We said, what does equity mean to you? That's a reasonable question, right? Let's try it. What does equity mean to you? Exactly right. You're a smart person. That's what PhDs say. That's what the smartest people in the country say. All the smartest people that I know answer it just that way. You must be brilliant. How many PhDs you got? Let me tell you about the man in Jackson, African-American, 45 years old, cuts grass. Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones, what does equity mean to you? He said, what you talking about? I said, equity. What does equity mean to you? He said, boy, that's the amount of value I got in my car. That's what I own in my house. That was the universal answer. Oh, I swear, Lord is my witness. Of 800 people, folks on the ground that were not, let's just say, let's quote unquote, educated folk. I mean, but people that have real common sense, that it's really smart. that know how life works, their concept of equity is very different from what ours is in terms of what it is that we're trying to do. So the first challenge for us as we begin to think about equity being closing the gap between people that are similarly situated but aren't where they're supposed to be because of race or gender, that just concept has to be taught and understood in a different way. And so the language that we use to do this has to be communicated so that we're all doing the same thing. That was one of the first things that we learned that startled us, because it makes perfect sense that for the last however many years, when we were talking about equity, people were talking about financial equity and not racial equity. So that's something that's really, really important for you guys to think about. But as you think about this organization, you have to think about the corporate structure and whether or not, one, who you're hiring, what they look like, do they represent the city, does everybody feel like they can see themselves in this government first as a corporate entity. My sense of it is that you would know that better than anybody else at the moment and be held to account by the board, but you ought to look at yourself through that lens. If you really want to achieve equity, you got to walk the walk first before you start talking to the community about them doing it, because they will certainly come back to you and say, now that y'all are preaching that, how are you doing yourself? And Roxanne and Jeff can talk a little bit about that. But the more important, not the more important, but the equally important thing is whether or not you live in a community that understands and values diversity. And as we said earlier, when you were talking about budgets, budgets are moral documents. They are the things that actually reflect whether or not you mean what you say. So where you spend your money, how you spend your money, who pays, who gives, who gets is critically important. And when I was the mayor of the city, it didn't happen right away. It took us a long time. It probably took us 6 years, huh, Roxanne and Jeff, to get to the point where I would say to them, so Jeff was my chief administrative officer. Roxanne was running the equity program. Sarah was running the mayor's office. Erin was running Homeland Security. When people, and we had a strong mayor, as I said, so they came to me for the budget, not the county executive, but you may do it the same way. I would say to them, don't come to me with a budget that's not an equity budget. In other words, I want to see it. I want to see the city through an equity lens. Tell me how you're using the assets that we have to close the gap. Not just not to discriminate, but to close the gap between the two. And then let's bake that into how we do budgets every year. So when a department head knows that he or she has to answer that question that way, what they ask you to spend money on and how they spend it looks vastly different than just putting money back where it was the year before. I don't know any of these folks. They all look like wonderful people. But I assure you that before they got here, the city worked a certain way. And the most pressure that they have is just to do it that way again, because it's easier. We'll start off with the baseline budget. What was it last year? It was $500. Great. Bring me a budget that's $500, and the only thing that changes is move it up or move it down a little bit based on the revenues that you have coming in. And we're all good because we balance the budget, which, by the way, is really important. It's important not to spend more money than you have, okay? But the pressure on them is just to kind of add to it and delete from it based on whether or not the managers are doing a good job. I would suggest to you, don't do this all at once because it'll make you crazy. But over time, you want to change that question. And you want to start giving people incentive to bring you a budget that actually corrects where you see the deficiencies. Now, that's a big thing, where you see the deficiencies. You have to see it. You can walk by stuff every day and not see it. I'm a perfect example of that. I walk by those monuments every day, and it never occurred to me until my friend hit me in the back of the head and said, I need you to look at that and tell me why it's there. And I'm like, man, don't bother me. I'm busy. He goes, well, look, I'm busy too. But that's offensive, and this is why, and do you know what that means? And then when we started really opening our eyes and then asking ourselves whether we were doing what we said we were doing, then things began to change. So as a community, I don't think that you can answer those questions unless you deal with the issue of race. I don't know what the demographics are of Arlington. You're in Virginia. Virginia's getting more diverse. Virginia's getting more open. You're the northernmost part of the South. I get that. But the people that are above the Mason-Dixon line and everywhere up, they got problems too, okay? And you're getting more diverse, not less. And you're going to get shut out if you don't open up. I think y'all have done a fairly good job, it seems like demographically, but on the ground where y'all live, it just may look that way. From up here, it may not feel that way on the ground. And communities that feel that way on the ground, that talk that way and act that way, are the ones that, in my opinion, are going to have the economic dividend that's coming our way when the country becomes as diverse as we think it's going to become. Because I got news for you. That's not going to stop. We're going to continue to get more diverse, not less diverse. It's not you can contain that, just like you cannot contain that virus. And as it relates to human being, it would be a terrible thing to do anyway. So that wave is coming, and you got two options. You can run away from it, or you can run to it. You can run and hide and be with people that look just like you and hope you're all right, or you can engage completely and get the benefit of the great things that so many different diverse people have to be, which I assure you, because God does not make mistakes, that's the way it was designed, not the way we manipulated it. And so I think the first thing you have to do before you get into the how, you have to, as a community, acknowledge, A, that you have a problem, B, that you want to be together, C, figure out what's stopping you from getting together, and D, figuring out a way to get together. Every community is different. I wouldn't profess to tell the people how to do it. Y'all dance to different songs up here than we dance to. Y'all don't have gumbo the way we have gumbo. Y'all might eat other stuff, and it's probably good, too. So I'm not saying our food's better than you, although I think it is. I'm not saying that. I want to start a fight about that. So as I end on this, because I want to be able to answer questions in more detail, I am much more interested not in the thing that you're going to do to achieve the objective, because there are mechanical ways to make that happen, but your willingness as a community to confront and to address this in a way that can be constructive. Now, most of my comments today, even though I didn't say it, were more geared to white ears than the African-American ears, because I cannot profess to speak on behalf of the African-American community or to them. I will offer some thoughts about that. Notwithstanding what you feel on the national level, most white people are not hateful people. And most white people don't want to hurt other people. And most white people that I have talked to about this are beginning to hear things that have been said before, but they didn't hear. Like Jesus on the road to Emmaus. It was like, oh, I didn't know what that meant. Okay, now that you do, there is an openness now and a willingness. No, that's not what it looks like on national TV, but I'm telling you, in my personal experience, on the ground, in the South, in rural areas and urban areas. By the way, rural is not white and urban is not black. That's a lie. That's not true. This is not true. That's just factually not true. And that people are open if you give them a way to get to you. You have to give them a way to get to you. If you condemn somebody, their ears close. And this is true on both sides of the aisle. So this is a hard conversation because it has to go both ways. And to the white people in the room, I would say this, in terms of white privilege, reparations, all of these things that trigger you, it's okay that they do, but you should be open to trying to understand what that means and not feel like it's a personal assault on you. Because the one thing that I think most African Americans, although it's not one community, it's many communities, have said, is that there is agony and pain in the country not acknowledging that slavery was so awful, that it produced a terrible consequence, that those consequences continue to exist today, and as a consequence, we still have an unlevel playing field. And if we as a country can't admit that, it's really going to be hard to get to wherever we're going. So we're not even talking about an I'm sorry now. We're talking about just an acknowledgement that it happened and that it continues to exist today. I don't know how to take the country to the next thing if we can't get to that. And so that's why you've seen some of us say things like, we're going to begin to not force that acknowledgement, but acknowledge. And that's what taking down the monuments is about. But that's just the very beginning. That's like the very beginning of tipping your little bitty tip of your big toe in the cold water. You got to get in and get fully immersed on this thing if we're ever going to be the country that we say we're going to be. And I just happen to have great hope and great faith that what's on the other side of that is exponentially better than what we have right now. So if I told you I've been to the mountaintop, and I've seen the other side. Been to the mountaintop, and I'm telling you, on the other side of that mountain, that is the end of the rainbow, and there's great stuff. Why wouldn't you want to go? And how many people have you heard that you now think are prophetic people, that you think are saints? Dr. King comes to mind right away, but you can think about Gandhi, you can think about Mandela. I mean, tons of people that now we revere as saints who said, I promise you, it's better over there. You know what this feels like. You're seeing the other side of it right now on what it feels like for a country to retract and to go back and to isolate and to exclude. That does not feel good. I don't care whether you're a conservative or you're a liberal. I do, but for purposes of this discussion, what I'm saying is whether you're one or the other, this does not feel good. And it's not who we're supposed to be. And I am going to find a way to prove to everybody, and I think that the data is already there, that we're going to be better from a national security perspective. We're going to be better from an economic opportunity perspective. We're going to be better from a community perspective when we get on the other side of that hill. And it's just waiting for us. So from my perspective, this is simple, but it's really hard. And although I don't have the right to ask for patience, my grandma used to pray, Lord, be patient, but hurry up. The sooner we get there, the better that we're going to be. And we're just continuing to hurt ourselves. And the steps that we now have to make are the ones that y'all are asking. And this is why I'm so thrilled that y'all asked us to come today. What is it actually that we're supposed to do personally and in our organizations to actually make this truth a reality? And the fact that so many of you are here today is an indication that this community is really willing to have this discussion. I'll end with this. It actually, as hard as this is going to be for you, this is actually the easy part. It's statewide in Virginia. When you get outside of Arlington, you get into the State House, and you start talking about this across a southern state that doesn't really look like Arlington or may not have the same number of people that have come from different places. That will be a great challenge because this is a deep wound that continues to fester in the South. And the only way I know how to do it is to go see everybody and to talk to them and to see if we can guide them through it. And that's why we're here today. So I thank you. I know I've talked a long time, but there is nothing more critical to the future of our country than this. This presidential race has laid bare 1,000 different issues that have to be resolved. They're all important. But you can't do any of those. None of those things will be done as well as they need to get done unless we get past this issue in our country. This is the one thing that has universally held us back as a nation. And until we fix this and find a new way, whatever it is that they produce is not going to fall correctly, and it's not going to yield the benefit that we have, which is why this work, in my opinion, is the most important work in the country. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Mayor Mitch, how would you like to proceed? We could take questions, we could have comments, we could move to Jeff and Roxanne. What would you like to do?
Y'all want to hear from Jeff and Roxanne, or you want to do a question?
Why don't, yeah. All right, so we're at an impasse here. I'll just make a decision. You look ready to talk. Yeah, I think so. Let's hear from Jeff and Roxanne, and then we'll have a conversation after that, if that works for people. Yep.
Okay, thank you. And I'll be brief, and actually I'll just pivot to Roxanne on these because we did this as a team. Yeah, and Aaron. Aaron actually was one of the department heads who had to go through this after we designed it. I think. Jeff, can you pull that microphone? Sorry. I think what the mayor really just talked about is sort of at the high level what we did in our budgeting process to reform what we call our strategic framework of our budget. So what's the vision for the city, and how does, as the mayor said, the budget is a moral document, and so how does the budgeting process reflect the vision that's being set out? And so we were very, very deliberate about building a strategy for changing our strategic framework of our budget, which is sort of the front matter of the budget and sort of the goals that we're trying to achieve, to really in 2017? For the 2018, yeah. Start to think about equity and resilience in budgeting. And everything that the mayor was talking about bringing the community together to have the conversation has to reflect and be institutionalized in government. And we have a lot of conversation. Many cities, many counties across the country have lots of conversation about these issues, either publicly and sort of forward from the government standpoint or in community, but very few have taken the step and institutionalized the thinking into government processes, government budgets, and that sort of thing, which is sort of the next step in what you're actually attempting to do here. The other thing I would say is parallel to budgeting are all the other operations of government, including procurement and your spend, which is also extremely important. And then the third thing I would say, and I'm going to go back to budget, but the third thing I would say, which is really important for Arlington, is thinking about growth and how growth can be inclusive. And so that's sort of your economic development structure. You have an incredible opportunity here that's coming your way with HQ2 and all the other sort of ancillary economic development opportunities that will come out of that. Starting to look at inclusive growth so that as you are growing, there are no unintended consequences of that growth, which furthers to exacerbate what we're just talking about right now. So all three of those things are very important. I'm going to first, though, go in budget, and which is, I think, where it all starts. And so what we designed was a process for our department heads to go through this education process, as the mayor said, about what equity even means, and design that process to bring the department heads together to start to understand what it means and then have ideas about how to apply equity in their individual budgets. Right, so this wasn't just sort of a strategic framework and goals, it was every single budget offer coming in from every department had to have an equity and resilience lens, and we provided, actually, Roxanne, provided the technical assistance to the department heads to get them through that process. Once we got them through that process, at the end of the day, they had to submit their budget offer and had to include their best efforts on what Roxanne is going to tell you in a second, and we created a new budget portal, online portal, to capture that information, and every single budget had to have it in it, and when it was reviewed, we went through each piece of that to review and had to go back to many departments. And frankly, I think Roxanne would probably agree with me, we were shocked at how amazing the department heads were in doing this after having gone through the exercise. And we got a budget in 2018 that reflected that sort of strategic framework and all the things that the mayor was just talking about, because we went through a very deliberate process with the department heads to educate them and then provide them with the tools that they needed to actually structure a budget and the office hours and everything else that they needed. So that was sort of our attempt to institutionalize through the budgeting process. There are other things we did with policies and regulations and procurement, but I think it's very important that we start with the budget because that is the moral document of any governmental entity. And I think that was, for us, a great place to start. And so Roxanne, who sort of led that process of getting the department heads up to speed, you can go through the detail, and then maybe Aaron can talk about what it was like going through it.
Can you hear me? Okay. Locals are, I have a lot of notes because I want to be able to give you all the examples. I was told to provide details. Thank you, Jeff. So yes, this process is very important when you're looking at addressing equity in government. And addressing it through the budget was a critical step. I will say that as a former city person, working with our peers and learning from our peers across the country is critical for this work. You have to lean on your peers because we all are going through learning experiences, and when you can bring a practitioner who you can identify with, but they're your, peer in Portland or, Chicago or Atlanta, hearing it from them is different, rather than some consultant coming in and talking about what people in government do. And so what we decided to do was bring a former director of an equity office from another city to provide training for department heads on this specific issue and give specific examples from departments that were actually used. Crazy thought, right? So that people could see it. One of the other things I do want to say, though, this didn't just happen. It wasn't like it just hatched. We spent a year prior to this doing an entire planning process, which the mayor, I appreciate, thank you again. I said we'd get there, and we did. Was very patient, but we did a process internal to government and external to government. And just really quickly, I just want to talk about what we did. We did a lot of stakeholder engagement. We did a definition session where we were trying to figure out what does equity mean. We got 90-something people in the room, to agree to a working definition of what equity was going to mean for our process. We also did over 400 individual stakeholder interviews. We did focus groups. We did community listening sessions. I mean, we really want to hear from people. So not just government folks and not just business leaders and education leaders, but also neighborhood organizations. And we also heard from youth. We also heard from people coming back from incarceration and parents of public school kids. We really want to hear from them what their vision of equity was for their government. And then we also pushed it out on social media and websites so that people could kind of learn a bit more and follow what we were doing. And we did a city employee survey. So over 900 city employees responded to a survey about equity. And then we also created these teams. So that's what I'm getting to. The teams. We started to provide training from GARE and other providers so that people could understand why equity was important for us to address in government and get more comfortable with it so that they could then act in their roles. And so the day that we had the training for the budget process, those individuals in the room, so it was department heads and also managers within those departments, they were primed, they were ready. This wasn't like a new concept that was kind of pushed on them. They were already thinking it through. And so the goal of that exercise, which gets us to where we are, was to identify equity-focused work that they're already doing. What we recognized over that year was that there were departments that were already doing equity-focused work, but they didn't call it that, or they didn't realize that it was equity-focused work. Also, we asked them to recognize opportunities to prioritize equity-focused work budgets and then incorporate it into future budgets. So we had 4 key questions that they had to go through, they workshop through, and then submitted with their budget proposal. Can you identify considerations in your, bear with us, it's 2018 budget as it is currently proposed? Then we asked them, well, what are the desired results and outcomes? We asked them, are there specific, and I can send all this to you, specific elements in your proposed budget that either advance or inhibit equity? So when we go back to your 4 actions in your resolution, what's advancing, what's prohibiting? The next is, how can you use existing resources? So this whole, I need more money, let's look at the money that you have. And how will it allow you to prioritize equity? How would you do it and why? And then finally, how could considerations of equity build your department's capacity to engage with and include communities most impacted by equities in your community? And that could be, we gave examples like targeted hiring, improved internal leadership opportunities, advisory committees, targeted community meetings, stakeholder groups, and increased outreach. All of those things were some of the things that we heard from residents they wanted. People wanted contact with their government. When we asked people what they wanted, one of the things they said, we want to know what our government's doing. We want to know about programs. We want to know about how we can be responsible citizens in this community, but we want to have contact with our government. And so they were very much interested in government outreach. So things like that are important and pivotal for many departments to effectively do their jobs. So those were the questions we asked, and it was really, really great because the examples that were given to them, they were able to see, whether it was the Water Bureau thinking about doing an equity lens in their employment recruitment, whether the Public Information Department was hiring a communications equity position that could focus on ensuring that things are accessible. A lot of times, we don't have documents in multiple languages. A lot of times, we are not thinking of our residents that have visual and hearing impairments, right? when we think about where we hold meetings, is it accessible and based on people's mobility capacity? And so it was about racial equity, but we know that when we all do better, when we all do better, we all do better. And so some of the other examples were considerations of equity. The city's attorney's office in the city allocated an attorney position to focus on community justice and civil rights. So, for example, their city attorney had the power to address some of the ordinances and enforce ordinances that then address some of the civil rights issues in the city. And a really creative idea one of them used was to create 2 honors attorney positions. So they allocated 2 of their FTEs to recruit and train new lawyers that were focused on a commitment to furthering equity in public service. So that was fantastic. We're continuing to address the needs of government down the line. And then I wanted to also share a couple other ones. It's not necessarily allocating an FTE. It may be ensuring that you have training for your department that they need. It may be having conversations and outreach that is targeted to the people that you want to reach the most. I always think of this one example, and I'll give it very quickly, when you make a budget decision. In the city that helped us, there was the recreation department. They had gotten a complaint about a women's only swim hour that was twice a week. And when you first thought about it, they were like, oh, well, we should just get rid of that, I mean, is it utilized? Da, da, da. Well, the equity office stepped in and said, hold on. Let's go to the facilities where they're being held and talk to the staff on the ground, talk to the people that utilize it. Well, what they realized was that women from communities where co-ed swim would not be aligned with their either faith beliefs or they couldn't swim if those hours didn't exist. So not only would it have had a negative social impact on those communities, it also would have had a possible negative health impact on those communities. And so by doing that extra due diligence and making those considerations, they were able to recognize, this is maybe, they were able to make a decision about that without making anyone have a disparate outcome. And when they went back to the individual actually who made the argument to get rid of it and they explained it, they said, I never thought about it. And that's part of this. I'd never thought about it. And so that's another example of how quick decisions without kind of a tool and asking who benefits, whose burden, who is missing, and how do we know, changes can be made that are not seeking the outcomes that you really, really are looking for. I'll stop there. I can answer so many questions. I mean, there's just so much to share.
Can I just say one thing that I think is very important, and it gets back to Mayor Landrieu's comment earlier about having a balanced budget. So my job was always to go to him with a balanced budget. And many places you go when you hear these types of things, you think, oh, that just sounds like more money. Yeah. I was giggling a little bit because the point where you made the point about using your existing resources, I think I added that in there because we were not adding to the budget, but it wasn't just sort of a budgetary making sure that we had a balanced budget and had the resources. I truly believe that unless we think about institutionalization in existing programs, you will not change. Yeah. So part of what I've been doing when we were in government and now outside of government in working with cities is on institutionalization. And this is not an add-on. Mm-hmm. This is about working with what you already have and institutionalizing it in the system, in the budget, in what already exists, because if we continue to think of these things as add-on, there will be no transformation. And so it was partially about making sure that we had a balanced budget, but also the theory that unless it is institutionalized in the system, you will not have transformative change.
And I appreciate that comment because this is not a special program. I mean, we call them initiatives, but this is not a special initiative. That's like, this is the thing. It needs to be baked in. And I will also say really quickly, so as the individual department heads were able to propose, address these questions of their budget, we also asked them to make sure that it was realistic, adequately resourced. That's a lot of the other problems. People will say, oh, we'll do this and this and this, and they don't think about data they may need to collect, or who's going to do that work. And, equity work can't just be a part of somebody else's job. It has to be a part of everyone's job. So if someone's already in a position, adding equity onto their work may be very difficult for them to actually help make it go through government. Now, one of the things that we were able to do, and I'm very, very proud of, is that for our 2018 budget, we allocated general funds for 3 positions to actually create an equity office. And so what that does is there's 3 people that were there to help implement our strategy throughout government. Their job wasn't to, run permits and do some equity. Their job was to focus on equity 100% of the time. So that allowed them to support department heads, management, and staff as we all began to implement it through our work. So that is a huge thing. So that is also part of the critical piece, is that you really need to have a dedicated position that can help lead the work, support the work, provide technical assistance, and support their colleagues. That it's not just like an added feature of an existing job.
Thank you. All right. So I'm going to say a few things. I'm going to warn you, Mark. I'm going to turn and see if there's anything you would like to say or ask. I'm going to give you just a chance to, because this is obviously about the people who are actually making it work. And I'll just say, as I'd mentioned to some of you on my time in the school board, we did a lot on closing the achievement gap. And we were looking at all different kinds of students. And what I learned there, which I think is what I'm hearing from you, is the work we did to help students of color achieve better helped all students. It made it better for all students. The work we did to make it better for students who had mobility challenges and other challenges, it made it better for everybody. And that actually ended up being our key on how you kind of sell it or whatever to the community, because you're really making it better for everyone, which is so important. So, and there's so much here. I wrote a little note to myself, don't assume. I think that's one of the messages I got. I think that was a great story, Roxanne, thank you. So I think what I'm gonna do is see if our manager, because it really is about the staff doing some things, and we've been doing a lot of thinking about this, and then I'm gonna turn to my colleagues and see what kind of questions, comments they would like to make. So thank you. Mark.
I wanted to start with one question, and I think that Samia and Aaron, I'm going to encourage you all, and we'll have some department heads here with me. We're at the very beginning of something that we've called a journey, so it's not something where we're going to say, I like to comment, a lot of my department heads, just like myself, we're type A people. In other words, give us a problem, we'll come up with 3 or 4 points, we'll implement it, we'll check the box, and then we'll move on to the next thing. And it's a values conversation. It's been very difficult for our senior leadership. That's not a criticism of anybody. It's just been very, very difficult. So I wanted your thoughts on training, because it can't just be for us and also for the department heads. It needs to be everybody in the organization. We have about 3,700 people in the organization. I've set aside what is probably a pittance in the current budget for training. What is your experience? Now, we work with GARE. We have a cohort. But how is it that the rank and file, and I mean that everybody who works, can try to get their head wrapped around these concepts? It's very, very difficult for us in senior management to do it. But how do we have everybody participate? That is, before I even go down like specific programs, that is the big issue.
So the last piece that I did not share was that we were coming towards the end of our time there. But one of the things that we wanted to do was to ensure that the administration that came behind us had funds to continue this work and implement the strategy fully. One of the elements of the strategy was for every city employee to participate in a version of racial equity training. And so that's the thing, people have to be trained. There's not a small dose that can be given, because it's such a, it's such a difficult thing to work through. You have to have everyone get trained eventually. So, from the person who turns a light off, the last person at the building, to the person who turns it on in the morning, everyone eventually needs to have the training, because they have to as a collective, we're working towards something, no matter what our job title is, we all have to be, have this as a common understanding about what our goal is.
So I just want to build on that a little bit. You talked about taking a year to actually design a process up front. So we're in sort of a position where we've done a lot of different things, somewhat desperately too. And how do you bring people together that are at different places and maybe take a step back to actually design a process that will move us forward? I mean, I feel like we're all over the place right now. How do you kind of bring it together?
Let me take that for a second. With respect to the organizational structure of this government, in New Orleans, it was a strong mayor system. So I don't know who it is that has the power to, or the convening capacity to bring people together, whoever that is, or whatever group that is. Then you have to use your convening power to convene. So first question, well, who am I going to convene? Well, I'm, as you can tell, I'm very impatient. And I was like, man, it's going to take us a year? And they were like, no, it's going to take us longer than that, but we do have to plan well. And consistent with the talk I gave before about de jure and de facto, that applies here too. The mayor can ordain, or the board of supervisors can ordain, and you can tell your department heads to do whatever. But if your government is like ours, you have civil people that are working in civil service who may not like or may not agree, who are sitting here thinking, I'm going to be here a lot longer than they are. So I'm just going to lay down on it. And, hopefully they'll forget about it later, because all politicians, forget about what they say they're going to do. Which why we talked about it actually baking it into the DNA. So to be clear about this I actually believe that you need to balance your budget, that you shouldn't spend more money than you have, and you ought not be spending one-time money on recurring expenses. That's it. It's part of equity, but it's not the same thing. Like when I say to Jeff, look, you got to bring me a balanced budget. That's what we did a couple of years, because we were almost bankrupt and we had to cut 22% out of our budget in 6 months. I know that hurts, right? But we were in a hell of a mess. And when we started getting out of it and getting healthy, we just assumed that we were going to have a balanced budget. Then we said, but it has to be an equitable budget too. And that didn't mean adding more money or taking more money away. It didn't really have much to do with that. It had to do with how each one of the budget units within whatever amount you were going to spend, how they performed and what they did. And the same thing was true about resilience. So essentially what happened, the idea is over time, let's just say it's $500 million. Whether you had more or less, it's how that money was spent and what objective it was supposed to be producing. So if you're going to do that, you have to start with the people who help you build your budget. So, I think you're going to have to do two things at once. So there's a specific training that you have to do of each of your department heads or whoever your budget units are to get them on the same page about what the words mean. What do you mean you want me to be equitable? What do you mean you want me to be resilient? And have that discussion so that you can get on the same page while simultaneously having community meetings. I don't know if you do, we had budgeting for outcome meetings where we would go around the city and have open meetings where 1,000 people came and got to tell us what they wanted. Now, what was really interesting about this is at the end of every cycle, one year we have 5 council districts, but 2 at large. One couple years we did 7 meetings. We eventually started doing 5. But it got to be really clear, no matter what community we were in, and we had a lot of disparate communities, that essentially almost everybody in the city had the same exact priorities, which made our budgeting process, although we were yelling and screaming amongst ourselves behind closed doors about little bitty programs here and there. I'm sure y'all don't do that. But generally speaking, in the big buckets, we kind of knew, blighted housing, crime, et cetera, et cetera. We're talking about within that. We're talking about the bone marrow, though. Within those particular units, how do you allocate those funds in a way that's equitable? And over the years, what you will see if you map it, is that 4 years ago, you spent that $500 million this way. 4 years later, you spent it looks different texturally and looks different, down into its deep bones about who gets what and where and what the thing is producing. So you've always heard the prison to pipeline, the school to pipeline thing. Well, that's a pipeline. It's designed in a way that it forces people. This is creating a new pipeline within the budget. So after you have the community, you're listening to them with one hand, but internally you're having meetings with your department heads about trying to say, now next year, when we go back out and do that, we're going to do it a different way. And then they start moving it down the line to their direct reports. Now, at some point in time, you have to get to the line employee, because there's nothing worse than as the mayor going out and bloviating about the way things are going to be, and being in a public meeting and having a wonderful constituent say, well, that's nice, but you're a big mouth, because yesterday I was in your Department of Safety and Permits, or I was in your finance department, or I was at a recreation playground, and this is what Jim or Joe or, Jaquetta said to me about it that's completely inconsistent with what you just said. So you don't know what you're talking about. You don't want to hear that as the mayor. And one of the things that you have to do, and that takes time, by the way, and it takes repetition, and it takes buy-in. Now, this is not going to surprise you, but not everybody in this building is going to buy into what y'all want to do. Even though you say, I'm the one that's elected and I hear the people, you're still going to have some dissenters. That's just going to happen. But to the extent that you can, understand that you live in a democratic process and you do have civil service, you have to basically train them and repeat that over time, this is going to be our new way. And that doesn't take 1 year or 2 years. I think it takes time. And of course, the challenge with this is, again, respecting your system, is that in a strong mayor system, well, I started this 2 years before I left, and now there's a new mayor. I'm hopeful that she's going to continue to do what we're doing, and I think that she is, but let's just say that we didn't like each other, and she might have thought I was a terrible mayor, and she said, well, I don't care what they did, I'm going to undo it. Your civil service folks are going to be like, man, I feel like I have whiplash. So some level of continuity is necessary. You can only get that, I guess, is if you get buy-in from the ground up to the extent that you possibly can, because people believe it's a better process. You have to spend a lot of what my grandma would call elbow grease on training and repetition.
Yeah, thank you. We're a little lucky with a 5-member board with rotating. We're not all up, and it's great. I was going to see any follow-up. Did you have something you want to say, Jeff? I'm sorry.
I just wanted to,
Yeah.
one of the things I think that strikes me about the process that department heads are going through right now, and to answer one of Samia's questions, every once in a while I have this voice in my head, and I can't tell if it's the mayor with angel wings or with a little pitchfork. But one of the lessons that has always been ingrained in me is linking and leveraging. And I think this is an opportunity where, for example, one of the things I'm trying to do with our current process is I have some colleagues who have what I would consider to be fairly advanced programs within their department. And I hope they don't mind me giving them a shout out, but it's Diane Christian Libraries and Anita and the folks at the Department of Human Services. I really feel like that's one of the ways in which we can help departments sort of advance at a more equal playing field is by linking and leveraging. And that's one of the challenges that he gave us was you grab your partner, you grab your department head, you grab your friend who you have made a lifelong friend in going through this training and learned things about where someone's origin story. And you figure out a way that you can achieve that together for a better outcome, instead of relying on your own independent, point of view and or silo. And when you break that down horizontally, you're not only doing that in advancing, the government from an operational standpoint, but you are working together to ingrain this into the everyday operations of your department and setting an example for those that are down the line and what the expectation is and how you do that. And that's one of the things I think that I'm attempting to do, and I hope I'm getting there, and I hope my colleagues, don't mind me sort of leaning on them in that way.
I'm glad I'm in Aaron's head. But can I just tell y'all about this? This is a theory, this is a governing process that we use in the city. And it comes from the fact that we were small and we didn't have a lot of money. And the only way we could do stuff is if we had partners. So outside of government, you need the faith-based community, you need the not-for-profits, you need the business community. You need them in the room thinking about this and helping you. All right, but inside of government, fancy people with PhDs, now we use the word intersectionality, right? Okay, you know what that means? That means like sharing M&Ms in first grade, like at lunch. That's great. That's even a more, that's a dollar word. That's not even a 25-cent word. But this idea is to use the power that you have to facilitate gatherings. So you guys have particular power. You can gather big people. But for those of you that are department heads, you know in your mind. So I'm looking at fire, I'm looking at police, I'm looking at safety and permits, I'm looking at recreation. What you will come, you already know this, if you just say this, that there are lots of other people that do the same things you do, and that you can't operate in silos, and that y'all depend on each other in many, many, many ways. I mean, like when you're out in the street taking care of a kid that got hit on a playground. You got the rec people out there. I guess fire is your EMS. So fire's out there, NOPD's out there. All of a sudden, all these organizations have to be working together, like in a really coordinated effort to have a good outcome for that child that, let's just say, broke their arm on the playground and got hit by a car or something. In any event, what we don't practice day to day before that emergency happens is meeting and figuring out all the things we have in common to see if our budgets actually suggest that we're supposed to work together. So facilitate is one. Link. Who are the other people that are working in my organization that have common interests and common needs, right? Link, facilitate, link. And then how do we take our disparate assets and leverage them to produce a good result for who? The end user. And so when people start thinking like this, it gets to be like a basketball team running a play. That's what it looks like, rather than somebody shooting a free throw shot. You understand the image? So that's why we call that facilitate, link, and leverage. And if that becomes the way of doing things all the time, what happens is the budget request doesn't go up. It just becomes an institutional, how do you get together and make it work so that it produces a better result with the same amount of money and the exact same people that you have, and breaking down the silos and understand that it's a team. And you have to give I would suggest to you or offer to you that you want to give your department heads not only an incentive to do that, but encourage them to continue to do that time and time and time again. So you're not just operating vertically and horizontally, but it's like a multi-dimensional chess game or a basketball game all the time. That's what
great.
that is.
Yeah, Roxanne, you wanted to say something. Thank you.
I just wanted to quickly add, I know I said, everyone should get equity training. We can fund that. One of the other things that is really critical is that a lot of our philanthropic large national philanthropies are recognizing that equity has to be core to all their grant making, and also recognizing that government needs help. Our budgets are tight. And New Orleans is a great example of how we use philanthropic dollars to address equity issues in our community. So I know you're part of the GARE cohort, but thinking about how you reach out for these opportunities to have philanthropy help fund this as part of the work, so that you are not so even though you're working within the budgets that you have, you also have additional funds to carry out the mission. I think that it was important for me to say that just because the opportunity is there much more now than it was 10 years ago.
Yeah, no.
Can
yes.
I give a couple of examples? I always think it's good to have in mind things that have happened or can happen other places. So one of the other examples in New Orleans in that budget was the fire department, which was surprising. I mean, it actually was almost an experiment to see what people would come up with. But the fire department had data where they actually knew neighborhoods where it was most likely people did not have fire detectors, and high rates of different types of activity related to fires and those sorts of things in those neighborhoods, and programmed in their budget a program to go and distribute fire detectors, smoke alarms in those neighborhoods based on data that were most vulnerable and needed that as a fire prevention measure in their fire department budget, right? As a way of thinking about how they would focus on vulnerable populations in their budget. And then a couple other examples.
No. We have to stop.
Well, I know what you're going to say.
Right there.
I know what you're going to say.
That was a nice theory. But let me tell you how to cow ate the cabbage and how this is hard, because this is what you want to know about. Because I'm going to tell you a couple things that are going to happen to y'all. Y'all don't know it yet. Y'all going to think I'm a seer. I'm not a seer. I've been whooped enough to know. So, I love y'all, the firemen. I love the firemen. But there's a relationship that the fire department and the police department have with the administration, right? And so, one thing that we always thought was we need data to determine what we're supposed to be doing. Now, if you want to get in a fight with your community, talk about moving firehouses. So if someone had a firehouse next door to them, you could go to them and you could say, you know, if I looked at the data about what kind of structural fires we've had in your neighborhood since 2013, the answer would be 0. We don't have any because everybody's got smoke detectors, and the way of firefighting and where they go and who's at risk has changed. We'd like to move that firehouse and that truck over to this neighborhood that has a lot of structural fires that needs us to get there quickly. Okay, now you got to fight. It's a big old fight, and it gets resolved however it gets resolved, but it's a painful thing. If you demonstrate through data that there are certain sections of towns that don't have smoke detectors and that you could save a lot of people's lives by them having smoke detectors, then you have to ask yourself, number one, how do they become aware that they don't have a smoke detector, although they know, but you help remind them of the danger that they're in. But how you get it there, who's going to pay for it, and how it gets put in. So maybe somebody would think, you know, that would be a good job for our firemen. But the union says, no, we don't do that. We just get on the truck and respond to fires, or we get on the truck and respond to when somebody's hurt, but we don't act proactively. Now you're in another fight. That's a labor management issue that has to resolve itself however it resolves. The only thing that we know is that we went through a reallocation of where our firehouses were supposed to be that were proximate to where the change was, and we helped change that over time. And we got, in like family fights, we resolved that there is some offer and our responsibility to go out and to identify places that need alarms and find a way to pay for them so that we install them ourselves. And it took a little bit of work between the fire department, the leaders of the fire department, the union, and the board to figure out whether that could happen. It has happened. It has produced significant reduction in risk to firefighters because they have less fires that they have to respond to where they put their lives at risk, and it's worked out well, but that was a lot harder than it should have been. So I just don't want to dance through that as an example of one thing that actually works. We did also the same thing about the placement. We have our own EMS system. Our firefighters are not our EMS first responders. They're our supplemental responders, about where to actually place ambulances throughout the day to decrease the response time that used to be too long. And that met with a lot of resistance too, because all of a sudden you're taking an asset from where it is that made people feel comfortable who didn't have as much use for it and put it where they needed to. That's an equity conversation too. So I'm not trying to make this Pollyannish. These are like hard discussions that need to be provoked, that will not be had if you don't want to have that fight.
Yep.
And then it stays the way it was.
Thank you. That sounds like another thing that was simple but hard.
Yeah.
Getting fire alarms in people's houses should be simple. I'd actually like to give my colleagues a chance to see if they've got any questions they'd like to ask. Matt, do you want to go first?
Sure. So first question, and I'll try and be really quick. This is really, really helpful. Bryan Stevenson's got a Retaking the Monuments. He's got a museum that's owning, and on Glebe Road in 1905 or 1904, it's just a fact that we had a lynching. And so part of the monuments is retaking that history so that we own that once that happened. And so I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. And then the other question is on implementation. It seems like there's a spreadsheet or a document that is shared, that a working document. And I'm just curious if you guys shared that broadly or just with department heads. But that's the sort of, because we all can do great talk about this issue, but operationalizing, as you've indicated, is challenging. So
Roxanne will take the question about implementation. But on the monuments, every community is different in how they handle this or will know about it. Bryan Stevenson, for those of you who don't know who he is, runs the Equal Justice Initiative. His primary focus is to make sure that individuals that are on death row erroneously are not there. But he has also built a national monument to lynching that is in Montgomery that you should go see. we opened up the African American Heritage Museum. This is not an adjunct to it. It's not a Smithsonian thing, but it is a national monument that remembers lynching. It will put you in the mind of walking through the Vietnam Memorial on the Mall. It is a spectacular space. But in any event, to commemorate a lynching, what it has is a metal sculpture coming down from the ceiling, and on the name of each one of the sculpture blocks are the names of the individuals that were lynched in a particular county in the United States. And if you have a county, or if this is a county, he has an extra one for you. But he will not let a county have it unless he's sure that it's going to be curated the appropriate way. Now, in the whole fight that we had about taking the monuments down, that did not include an argument that we should not remember vestiges of slavery. The people that had put the monuments up basically said, now that we knew we had a problem with them, well, wait a minute, we didn't really mean to be exclusive. Why don't you not take ours down? Why don't you just put yours up? And I think you're probably having that same discussion down the street with Monument Row about how to actually remember history the appropriate way. And the big argument is whether or not it should be on public property or not public property, et cetera, all complicated arguments. But there really isn't much debate about if you're going to curate something, curate it holistically. And yes, we should absolutely remember all of our history. And remembering the lynchings are other examples of oppression, the presence of a slave ship, the presence of the Underground Railroad, whatever it is, identifying individuals who are in the community, so that if you want to tell the whole story, you have to think about how you want to curate your city so that your city's space reflects the completeness of your history. And one of these, if this is a county, then he's got one for you. So you have to have the discussion about whether you want to receive it, and if you're going to receive it, where it's going to be, and how it's going to be curated. He would love to work. I'm sure that they would love to work with you if the community is open for it. But be ready for a complicated discussion that I think can be handled in a thoughtful way that'll be passionate and heated, but resolved in a way that will work for whatever it is that you guys think you should do.
Yeah, and help us move forward, I think. Thank you so much. Katie.
Thank you all for joining us this morning. I think one of my most trenchant takeaways, or that will really stick with me, was the example that I think you've all given, or the emphasis you've all put on, that this is really about reprioritizing existing resources. And I think, Jeff, your comment that if you just add on, you're not making change because you're not wrestling with the programs and allocations that have gotten us here, is such an important conversation as we continue to wrestle with that as a board, with our departmental leadership and our county manager's office, and certainly with our colleagues on the school board as well, because these conversations are taking place. So with that in mind, here's what I'm really interested in. You gave us a lot of great examples about how your departments shifted folks or prioritized certain elements of equity. What are there some examples of what you all stopped doing? We can come back.
I'm trying to think how to answer this because I used to have to answer to him, and as you can imagine, he's not the type of person who wants to stop doing anything. The best way I can answer that question is really looking at. Well, I'll say this: the good thing about working for someone like Mitch Landrieu was a focus on data-driven decision-making. Yeah. Right. And we didn't talk a lot about that, but before we got to equity and budgeting and all those things, at the very beginning, it was about data-driven decision-making. And I'm, off the top of my head right now, I can't give you exact examples, but I'm sure I can think of them and send them to Aaron to pass on, or maybe Roxanne is thinking of some. There are things that we stopped doing because the data showed that it wasn't effective. And that gave us the room to make what the mayor would call investments for the future. And that was sort of a governing strategy that we had, was if it's not working, and let me really see if it's not working, but if it's not working, those are resources that we can use, other things that are more or less investments in the future of the city. And we did a lot of that. I would also say there were ways that New Orleans, being an old city, and I'm not sure if Arlington County is like this, but I know for a fact New York is like this, and Boston is like this, other older governments, that there are lots of special funds that departments had hoarded and used for very ineffective purposes.
Who's he looking at?
That that we reprioritize those funds into things that we knew would be more effective than others. And these are all very difficult conversations, but it came from a place that we needed to balance the budget. We were not going to do what the past administration had done, which is frankly spend money to where when we came in we were basically
Right. Yeah, but in defense of people that hoard money. They hoard it for a reason. Like they think in their minds, this thing doesn't work, and if I tell them everything I have, I'm not going to have this for something I need. So you need open and transparency. You got to create an environment where people happily give their money back because they know they're not going to get punished for keeping it, right? So I'm not blaming y'all for doing it, but every government does. And when I went and asked people, why didn't you tell me about that? Because I was afraid if I didn't use it, I'd lose it. And I said, well, what if I created a situation where if you gave it to me, next time you got more because I trusted that you would do the right thing with it? That's a cultural thing that y'all have to fix. I know you want to answer a question, but I want to tell you about something that's about to happen to you. When I got elected, we had 48,000 blighted properties in the city. You remember Katrina hit, lots of people left, everybody was trying to get home. But it also found out there were a lot of property owners in the city that had been renting their stuff, and when Katrina hit, they just left their house to get all nasty and everything, like they left their garbage behind. So homeowners started coming to me saying, I've got this piece of trash next to me, you got to clean it up. And I'm like, wait, you want me to use your tax dollars to clean somebody else's property up? That's what blight is. We're talking about residential blight. So basically, we had also this competing thing about wanting everybody to return, but people weren't coming back home, and so people were now saying, well, the home next to me is reducing my property value, so I want you to get after blight. This was the number one thing. Even in communities of color, they said, man, you got to get rid of the blight. Well, we got after it. I think we took down 20,000 blighted properties or put them back into commerce. It's the most extensive blight reduction thing. We were successful, and we were really good at it. But it turns out that maybe we were too good at it because it produced a different problem. Because then when everybody started coming back into the city and moving into the city, the economy started growing, it started looking different and feeling different. So like if you go on 14th Street in D.C. right now, it looks a whole lot different than it did when I went to Catholic University in 1980. Here comes the G word, gentrification. And y'all about to get a big dose of it. So y'all beat everybody in the world with this big old thing that y'all got coming in here. And y'all love the fact that there's big companies coming here. Well, guess what's coming next? You know what's coming next, right? People that have money are coming in, and people that don't are leaving. Or if you don't have some kind of thoughtful way to deal with equitable housing, or this community is going to look very different. You may want it to look different. You may not want it to look different. I'm just saying you can't not be aware that the impetus and what's coming in here, if you push the balloon in one side, it comes out the other. So I made a very insensitive comment. I didn't even think about it when I made it, when they asked me about, like, what would you rather have? And I would say if I had to choose between blighted housing or gentrification, gentrification is a better problem to deal with. What I meant to say in a more sensitive way is that if you're a government or your community, the consequences of people moving out and having nobody live there and having a vacant city and having no tax base is bad, right? And it's a worse problem to have than how you deal with money coming in and people moving in. However, just like equity, it's not so much one or the other. It's how you deal with whichever one of those is coming. And if you look at it through an equity lens, it could actually be the greatest impetus for having the most diverse workforce in America. But you have to think about zoning. You have to think about housing restrictions. You have to think about low-income housing. You have to think about the way we dealt with it in the city. We kind of thought there were three options. We could go hardcore government regulation on rent control. We could go free market. Or we could say, you know what, if you want us to give you something, a height variance, a neighborhood that you're not supposed to be in, whatever it is, you have to help us achieve our goal of equity in the city and build into it housing for the workforce or parks or whatever it is. In other words, don't let this just happen without thinking about it. Now, the pressure on you is going to be tremendous because they got the money. And they're going to always be able to say to you, they'll never say it directly, but you know they're saying it. If you don't give me what I want, I may go someplace else. You know, New York was mean to me, so we left. And there's always a pressure. But if this company has any integrity at all, they will work with you to achieve these goals that have to be kind of set out front. But there will be tremendous, tremendous pressure to do it fast. I would say to you, do the best that you can to make it right. That's consistent with what you guys think your community should be.
Thank you. We actually do some of that already, so we have some practice, and we are finding this large company pretty interested. I think large companies are realizing if they don't help us, they're not going to have a great place to live. Yeah, no, I think we're heading into a whole different model, and it's part of the reason we have you all here today. Thank you. Christian.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This has been an illuminating discussion. Dr. Laurio, Mr. Hebert, and Mayor Landrieu, thank you very much. I think you've at least given me comfort that despite the fact that our equity initiatives are in their relative infancy and can seem inchoate, and Sami, I think you described them as disparate, that's actually exactly where we need to be at these early stages if we're going to actually institutionalize this and not just have it be a periodic initiative that we try and impose on our community, get some kudos and applause, and then we go back to business as usual. So you all have helped, I think, us a lot really, affirm how we're building this, but also given us some very practical advice for taking it to the next level in the months to come. Just a couple of observations, and then I do have a question here. Actually, a few questions, but I'll limit it to one. One, the moral document conversation about our budgets, I do appreciate that. Your budget should reflect who you are. You should find whatever vision, strategic framework reflected in the budget document that you have. And you all, it sounds like you get it, but I will say that in our community, a lot of people don't. They hear moral document and they think it can be as aspirational as you want it to be without recognizing that it's got to be grounded in the reality of not only balance, but what is achievable. There's an integrity and a dimension of equity that comes with not putting something on paper that you're actually not going to follow. So I'll just say for us, while budgets being a moral document are especially true for the federal government where you don't pass any, you can be as moral as you want. When it comes to municipal government, we've got to ground that moral vision in practical reality, which is something that it's an interesting conversation in Arlington. I love the framework for your work, Divided by Design. I think it's just really powerful in that language because it certainly takes us through the perniciousness of how the system that we have built has led us to the outcomes of where we are, but it's also hopeful because anything that was done by design can be undone by design. And Mayor Landrieu, I appreciate it's certainly going to be complex. While we can identify it simply, it's complex to undo. It can be done. And that degree of hope, I think, is something that everybody needs to understand, because when you think about 400 years of slavery leading to division that manifests through Jim Crow and de facto, de jure discrimination, it can seem hopeless. Are we ever going to get past this? Yes, we can. We can because it was done to us. We can undo it even though it's going to be difficult. The question that I have for you all is when it comes to language for community engagement. Just a little bit about Arlington. We've got a lot of people with degrees in Arlington. We've got people who are scholarly educated on issues of race and intersectionality and equity. We've got people who who are newly woke, and we got people who were never asleep. But my question is, what do we do about the many people who I would consider the populace who are not reflected in those categories, for whom often the language that we use when talking about this stuff can just go right past them or breed into some mistrust that this is something that elites are trying to do to them at their expense, and therefore getting them to become to get on board is often lacking, and they're critical for this to be successful. So open to your thoughts on how to engage in people with that as a concern.
I know what you're going to say. So, the mayor, who I love dearly, is very hard on me and the rest of my crowd. Although I do, I came from community work before I came to government, and I maintain that tie. One thing I will say is that it's very important to, yes, just stop using these 50-cent and dollar words and talk about real experience, but also through giving examples. There's a really fantastic article called The Curb Cut Effect, and it's by Angela Glover Blackwell. It's in Stanford Innovation Review. It's accessible. It talks about curb cuts and actually how the advocates that ended up helping to get the Americans with Disabilities Act started advocating in their community for curb cuts in the street. And because they, to make sidewalks accessible. And her point was that this is a perfect example of how we all benefit. She goes, if you stand on a street and you see the delivery guy with his cart going up the side, or you see the mom or dad with their stroller, or you see all these different things, and we think about how this curb cut that was created to help, quote, one community, how much we all benefit from it, and people go, oh, well, that totally makes sense, right? You have to give people real, tangible examples that they can connect with. And so you have to talk about it in a way that people can connect with it. I'll stop there.
That's great.
Ma'am, can I address that?
Of
Because it's
course.
really important. Language. I mean, if people can't understand you, if you're not communicating clearly with them. And so it's important always to ask who your audience is and whether or not they understand. Can you hear me? That's first of all. And am I speaking in a way that you can understand? Am I using words? I'm using languages. I'm using references. I'll tell a story on myself. Give lots of speeches all the time, and one of the colloquialisms that I use is canary in a coal mine. New Orleans is a canary in the coal mine for climate change. I'm just letting everybody know what's happening here is going to happen there. So I use it all the time. I have 5 kids. Kids are wonderful. Truth tellers. So my daughter says to me, she says, Dad, I've listened to you talk. She goes, what are you talking about? What is a canary in a coal mine? Never occurred to me that a younger generation of kids that didn't grow up on coal didn't know what that meant. And I had to explain it. But more importantly, if you explain it, people are not understanding. So I think we have to constantly ask ourselves when communicating, who am I communicating with? And am I communicating in words that matter? I'll give an observation. I certainly have a high regard for people that are well-educated. I'd like to consider myself to be well-educated. I have a degree from Catholic University. I have a law degree. I was a lawyer. I did a lot of stuff. I think I'm smart. And I think I have a good vocabulary. But I have come to learn that when I travel in circles of people that are smart, I taught at Harvard last year, and I taught a bunch of kids, and they were using words that I didn't understand. They were saying things that just like got past me, and I didn't know. And I had to ask, I'm sorry, what did you just say? What did you mean? All right? And I have noticed, whether in Policy Link, by the way, spectacular organization, and as is the Urban League ever. But I have noticed that those of us that are, quote unquote, have advanced degrees and learn the language from books that are written by scholars are using dollar words. I say that to you because I noticed that when I was on the ground, where I live, talking to my neighbors, my neighbor across the street who cuts grass for a living, or my neighbor next door that actually, fixes motors, or other folks, that they don't use the same language. And when I use that language, they don't understand that either. So when on the work of race particularly, this word white privilege, okay, it's now become ubiquitous. Most people, it means so many things to so many different people. If you're going to use it, you have to describe it. I can tell you this, the reaction that most white people have to be told they have white privilege is a negative reaction, not a understanding and an affirmation. And then you have to explain, no, I don't really mean that you're a hateful person. What I want you to understand is that you have the benefit of the doubt in many different ways in your life. And when you explain that, they go, oh, okay, well, I don't feel as hostile to that word anymore. You have to explain it. If you're explaining, you're educating, but you're getting intersectionality. People I don't even know, right?
Use it wrong anyway.
Well, most people use it wrong anyway. But when you're thinking about those kinds of things, the language that you use has to meet people where they are. So it begs the question, where are they? And if you want to find out where they are, you have to go to where they are and you have to ask them, which is why I would really encourage you, and this scares the heck out of elected officials, but I did it, and it hurt, but it was the most valuable thing that I did. As the mayor of the city, I had community meetings, and they were boisterous, and they were loud, and they took a long time, and they required a lot of patience. But when you go to those things and you hear, the language of the community will manifest itself to you. Now, you can move somebody to a new place, like the word resilience that didn't really exist in our vocabulary until after Katrina. It was kind of there. But now resilience is ubiquitous. Everybody uses it, and they use it, you know, the wrong way. But you can then begin to understand how you get to, and Councilmember, this is what you said that makes the word integrity. Now, integrity to me, in this instance, is not the same thing as honesty. Honesty is important and integrity important, but integrity is a different word than honesty. It means being tied together from top to bottom and left to right so that you are what you say that you are, you do what you say you're going to do, you walk the walk and you talk the talk, so that people are not unclear that when you say it's a moral document, you don't mean aspirationally. You mean like literally it is supposed to reflect who we do, because the first thing that's going to happen to you is you're going to get called out by saying you're going to be one way and being another, right? Now, people will forgive you for not being that way accidentally, but when they feel like you're selling them something, then they're not going to be for you anymore, and you have to have that kind of support. And so as you go through this work, this is what's called going through it, by the way, as opposed to just having an argument about it at a council meeting and say, we'll come back later. This kind of process is what going through it really means. Seeing where people are, listening to what they're saying, hearing what their words they're using, coming back and recalibrating, trying it again. If you have a program that's not working, getting rid of the program and admitting that, look, that was a bad idea, and it being okay, you know, that you don't pay a political penalty or the department heads for trying to do the right thing but doing it in the wrong way, so you change it, that's okay. All of those things are like going through it. What I believe that you will come to find is if you do this consistently over a number of different years, you're not going to be on a diet anymore. It will be a change of how you are. It's not the cherry on top. It's not the extra budget. It is infused in everything that you do. And I think that you can design a city that will produce the outcome that you envision if you find the pathway to that through an equity lens. And it's not easy. It is complex and hard, and it takes time, and it takes patience, and it takes perseverance. But at the end of the day, none of that stuff matters. Remember I told you about all the things the presidential candidates are talking about? If the essential truth is not something that everybody buys into, is that we all come to the table of democracy as equals. We're all entitled to responsibility and opportunity, and we are going to demand that no matter what we do, that it has to hit that star. That's the North Star for us. And if you don't have that, and if you don't attest to that being your thing, then you're going to lose your way, because the North Star will move from time to time. If that is the thing, everything will move towards that thing. And if you don't have that thing, it's just going to falter and fizzle, and you won't get where you want to go.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to wrap it up real quick. I get to make a couple of observations because I'm chair. One of the things, data-driven, I realize in talking to our transportation folks, I discussed this with some of you, we have communities that have been totally cut off. They don't fit the data with transportation. They don't qualify for things for transportation improvements because we've made a community that never will. And in that case, we have to examine that data and probably put in more money than the data would actually warrant, and we need to hear about. So I just want to say that. I've gotten that. Thank you. Also, so much of what you've talked about actually reminds me of medicine. So two things. There's a gentleman, I can't remember the name, worked on infections in hospitals and came up, he worked out of Johns Hopkins, lowering the infection rate, and found, and what he came up with, same thing that you say, just a slightly different way. Every system is designed to get exactly the results it gets. And that's how he lowered the, you know, you're not washing your hands, you're not talking to the doctors, which was cool. So, and the peer-to-peer, that's one of our key ways of handling, substance abuse and things like that. So this is medicine that you're dealing with. So thank you. We appreciate your coming and being doctors for us a little bit. I'm going to take a little point of personal privilege. Since I got on this board, 8 years ago, I've been trying to get us to have a strategic plan. We don't have one. We have a comp plan. It's really complex. I won't go into why, but I'm seeing maybe the reason that we don't have one yet is we've been waiting for this time because I think this kind of conversation, a strategic plan might be a really wonderful way to approach that long-term and infuse it into the community and get everybody here. So thank you for that, too. Finally, I'm a Quaker, and we always, yeah, oh, wonderful. Well, hello, Fred. So we have, as you know, we have meetings for, meeting for worship with a concern for business. And today feels to me like it's been a meeting for worship with a concern for business, and thank you so much for being with us. Thank you. And I'm assuming we can reach out to you for some help continuing. Thank you for coming. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much.
No. Get to meet your sister. Thank you. No, this is great.